of us know these things about climate change, but just to get on with your day and not want to top yourself, you probably switch off to it a lot of the time. But the way that David puts it, I guess, backed up with that sense of possibility, it personally allows me to connect back in with the issue, which is really difficult to stay connected with. So thank you, David, and thanks to Flo Watson, who seems to have left now. But thank you for the welcome to country. That was wonderful, also. There's so many things that I wanted to say, and I've got 15 minutes. So anyway, I basically, when David was talking about the need to get rid of coal-fired power, one of the most amazing things that I discovered when I first started reporting on electricity was that, contrary to popular perception, renewable energy did not make the price of electricity go up, it made it go down. And what they mean by that is the actual price of coal-fired electricity. So every single one of you, when you have your solar panels working, when you have that working at a peak time, you are cutting the amount of money that coal-fired generators get for selling that very expensive energy at peak times, because basically the energy market works like a share market. You guys might already know this, but at peak times of the day, coal-fired generators can sell energy for up to $10,000 per kilowatt hour, rather than at other times of the day it might be $10. So if you're producing energy for yourself at that peak time, you are cutting into coal-fired generators' profits, and we've already seen coal-fired generators have to shut down as a result. So anyway, that just sort of came to mind as I was watching David, because each and every one of you is making a really serious difference just by putting those panels on your roof. So David's taken us to this big picture vision of the world, but to affect change, we also need to get down to the granular and to the minutiae and to the hard, complex information so that we can understand what's happening and how to, I guess, combat the interests that are trying to get in the way. So as far as I can see, this conference is basically about two things: the potential to live in a country powered by clean energy and the interests that stand in the way of that. So to understand what's happening now, I thought we could travel back in time 150 years to 19th century Britain. And if you wanted to get around back then, you essentially had two options. You could go by rail or you could go by horse and cart. And these two industries, the rail and the horse people, they had transportation sewn up. So imagine their horror when a noisy little contraption with four wheels started appearing on the streets of London. It was obvious that this new mechanised vehicle had the potential to supersede trains and horses. And worse still, England was actually becoming a centre of innovation for automobiles. So to stop this abomination from spreading, the rail and horse industries combined forces and lobbied hard for the government to impose restrictions on it. And this might sound like a really familiar story because it's been repeated across history. The government responded, and in 1865, the British Parliament passed this law known as the Red Flag Act. All self-propelled road vehicles now needed to be manned by 3 people, including one who would walk at least 55 metres ahead of the vehicle carrying a red flag, to warn other people about the imposing vehicle about to run them down at 2 miles per hour. Speed limits mirrored walking pace, so 4 miles per hour in this country, 2 miles per hour in the city, and anyone caught breaking the limit would get a hefty fine. I think it was about £10 in 1865. So it took about 30 years for this Red Flag Act to be overturned. They sort of got rid of the red flag about 10 years in, but the rest of it stayed in place. So the rail and horse industries couldn't stop cars from taking over altogether, but they and the government did succeed in killing off the burgeoning auto industry in Britain. And basically, Britain lost its edge in vehicle manufacturing to the United States, France and Germany because of that critical 25 or 30 years where this legislation was in place. So back in the present, Australia is in a similar position to where Britain was in the 19th century, I suppose, because we're in a unique position to lead the world in rooftop solar. We already do, but rooftop solar and storage. But like powerful industries throughout history, electricity networks are doing their best to obstruct the transition to solar, or at least slow it down so they have time to adapt. But this time it's not just profits at stake. As David so eloquently explained, basically this is about switching to clean energy as a means of sustaining life as we know it and as we love it. So just to be clear, and I don't know how many of you are really across this subject, but when I say electricity networks, I'm not talking about the companies that sell you energy. So I'm not talking about Origin and AGL. They're just the shop front. So I'm talking about the public and privately owned companies that transmit electricity from large-scale power generators via the poles and wires into our homes and businesses. So you've got companies like Ergon in Queensland or Transgrid in New South Wales. Most Australians probably don't even know which network services them, but they certainly pay them a lot of money, because today around 51% of the average bill is made up of network charges. And in New South Wales and Queensland especially, those network charges are actually quite a lot higher than elsewhere around the country. So most of you are probably paying closer to 60% of your bill. So the networks have had the delivery of electricity sewn up for almost a century. And in fact, they don't even have to compete with other networks, because they're monopolies that each service their own area. And as coal-fired generators have huffed and puffed over large-scale solar and wind, the networks haven't worried a jot, because they don't care if energy comes from a big warehouse of green cheese. As long as it comes along their wires into your home or business, they're fine with that. They don't care either if it's transmitted solar power, but the democratisation of independently generated solar power has brought the fight right to their doorstep, because suddenly you guys have got panels on your roofs that don't require the use of a wire to deliver it to your home, unless, of course, it's nighttime and you don't have a battery. But of course, that is changing too. So in the space of under a decade, Australians have installed 1.4, I thought 1.4, now 1.5, which just shows you how quickly this is moving. Last time I checked, that was in November. Now it's 1.5 million solar power stations on their rooftop. And that's 1.4 million competitors that the networks now have to contend with. Up until now, those solar households still needed the grid at night, but as we know, that's about to change pretty radically too. Morgan Stanley predicts that by 2030, 2.4 million Australian households will have solar and battery storage. 2.4 million, that's about a quarter of the total of Australia's households. Whether these households leave the grid entirely or just stop using it most of the time doesn't really matter. Either way, network revenues are going to keep eroding. So if the networks had any vision, they might have adapted to these changes, but instead they've invested tens of billions of dollars into the grid as if demand for fossil fuel powered electricity would just grow and grow, which it hasn't. And now someone needs to pay for all this investment that's been made into the grid, despite much of it being unnecessary. Some networks are trying their best to adapt, but others are doing what most incumbent industries do when they're under threat, and they're fighting back. So attempts at little red flag acts have been popping up around the country. I think Claire mentioned South Australia. They tried to bring in the solar tax of $100 a year for solar households. They wanted to do that because they say that solar households have different energy consumption rates, patterns, and so they're being subsidised by non-solar households. Of course, there was no word of an air conditioning tax, despite the fact that the Productivity Commission has shown that for each 2 kilowatt air conditioning system installed, $7,000 in additional infrastructure is required to support it. On top of that, the network's own lobby group, the Energy Networks Association, said just last year that solar can help networks cut the cost of electricity because solar reduces demand on the grid and therefore reduces the need to build extra capacity. So everybody seems to agree that solar reduces the amount of money that's required to spend on the grid and therefore reduces electricity bills, but they still want to tax solar users for something. Anyway, when South Australia Power Networks took their case to the federal court, the court rejected it. So obviously that was a little too brazen. The networks lobby group has also come up with a number of red flag measures to keep their profits flowing. Last year they proposed compulsory grid fees for all homes and business, regardless of whether they're connected, and penalties for those who disconnect. So imagine if Telstra tried to charge everybody a compulsory fee for building the copper network, even if they didn't use it, because when they built it, they thought everyone would use it. Even the network seemed to understand, no, this is outrageous. And when I spoke to the head of the lobby group last year, he was already backing away from those proposals, or at least didn't want to talk about it on tape. But here in Queensland, the networks have managed to secure a change that will make it much harder for solar users, or anyone else for that matter, to save money on electricity. With approval from the Queensland Competition Authority, their networks have raised fixed charges for households by around 400%. And the person who first brought this to my attention was solar citizen Terry Vertigan. Is Terry here today? Oh, okay. Well, anyway, Terry's a champ, and he had took a good look at his electricity bills and thought, what the hell is going on here? Essentially, in 2011, he could see that fixed network charges were costing him around 27 cents a day, and by the middle of 2014, they'd risen to 50 cents. And in his last power bill, the charges had shot up to $1.16 a day. Now, the way that the networks have sort of got away with this is that they've reduced the volume charge of electricity. So that means that the actual electricity you use is not costing as much as long as it comes from the grid. But if you're a solar user, you're not using as much electricity from the grid. That's how you're saving money and making your solar panels work for you. So this is a way, I guess, to make sure that solar power users pay for the grid no matter how much of it they're using. And in the business sector, it's even more dramatic. You've got daily fixed charges for businesses increasing by up to 1,000%, going from just under $50 a day to around $500 per day. And again, the way that they've got away with that is by lowering the volume charge, the charge for the amount of electricity customers use. That means that business customers using conventional electricity won't see much difference in their bills, but businesses with solar, or just businesses that are trying to reduce the amount of electricity they use because it's so expensive, will find it much harder to save on those network charges. And network charges, as I mentioned earlier, are the lion's share of your bill. That's why when you go solar, you save so much on your electricity bill because you're cutting out a big percentage of network charges simply by cutting out the need for grid-sourced electricity for several hours a day. So this wasn't always the case. You know, network charges haven't always been this expensive, and neither has electricity, as you've probably all been aware. 2 minutes, oh, that's crushing. Okay, so basically, you know, I don't know how much about the network story you guys understand, but basically, since 2008, network charges have gone through the roof, supercharged by the network's $45 billion spending spree on the poles and wires. This is $47 billion. Okay, excellent, thank you. This is the number one reason electricity prices have skyrocketed. But here's the real twist in the tail, because a combination of hubris and greed have basically created the perfect conditions for rooftop solar and storage to flourish in Australia and the conditions for the network's own demise. You know, one of the major reasons that battery brands are flocking to Australia is because our electricity bills are so absurdly high. So thinking about how to sum this up in a minute. Basically, let me just sum up very quickly, Reese, how this actually worked, the story of the network's gold plating, just in case some of you don't understand. Every 5 years, the Federal Energy Regulator grants the electricity networks an allowance to spend on building and maintaining the grid. Networks have to produce a spending proposal that looks reasonable. It's up to the regulator to prove that it isn't. In around 2009, as the next 5-year cycle was starting, networks began to warn the electricity grid was buckling under the weight of rising electricity demand, and if they didn't build billions of dollars worth of new infrastructure, rolling blackouts would become the new normal. It just so happened that the biggest demand increases were going to be seen in New South Wales and Queensland, where the networks were government-owned. Electricity analysts were saying the exact opposite, actually, that projections were completely overinflated and we weren't going to see increases in electricity demand, anything like what the networks were saying, but nobody listened. The regulator approved $45 billion in spending, much of it on additional capacity to meet higher demand, but the projections were way off the mark. In fact, in 2010, for the first time ever, electricity demand didn't rise at all, it went down, and year after year, it's continued to go down. So just this is very, very important for you to understand as far as where the networks stand and why they want to keep spending on the network. The reason why they want to build more is because the more that they build, the more they get paid. Thanks to a very intensive lobbying and expensive round of legal appeals, all at the consumer's expense, the networks were able to secure an incredibly high cost of borrowing. That's the amount the regulator grants them to pay the interest on their loans. So in reality, their loans cost around 4 to 5%. The regulator granted them almost 9%, which is 4% of pure profit on billions of dollars that we're all paying for. But even that wasn't enough. So in an act of sheer gall, networks appealed that decision to the Australian Competition Tribunal, and with help from the finest QCs and international experts, all of which were being paid for consumers through their bills, they managed to jack that interest rate up to 10%. So this decision alone, one decision, netted the networks an additional $1.9 billion, all of it pure profit, all of it paid for by electricity consumers. So think of it this way. Imagine if the banks were given permission to charge homeowners a 10% interest rate on their home loans instead of 5% that was set by the Reserve Bank. That's what's happened with electricity. So basically, this has benefited the networks in a obvious way. In 2008, they made $180 per connection. In 2015, that had risen to $500 per connection. So it's a very expensive way to make solar a cheaper option. Let's skip that, and for Reese's sake, I'm going to just clip over to the end. But basically, you know, we're on the precipice of the biggest energy revolution since the electric light bulb, and there's one major obstacle standing in the way. We now have a gold-plated electricity grid that someone needs to pay for. But it seems that neither the government nor the networks really believe this transformation is going to happen, because in the federal government's recent energy white paper, battery storage was mentioned only 6 times. And when I spoke to the head of Ergon Energy, which supplies transmission to Queensland, he told me he doesn't think the battery storage will take off for at least another 10 years. And the reality is, he said, people don't want to be worried about electricity, they want to be passive. Well, I think there's 1.5 million households that are proving him wrong, and that number is only going to grow. And networks might think that they can innovate with one hand and slow down change with the other, but this is a dangerous strategy. Nobody wants the networks to go bankrupt, but consumers need a grid that works for them, not against them. So it's up to the networks now, and up to you guys as well, to figure out how they can admit to the new reality and adapt accordingly, or go the way of the horse-drawn carriage. Thank you.